Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome to Historic St. Mary City. If you haven't heard already, my name's Peter Friesen, the Director of Education, kind of the ringleader of some of today's events. So I hope everything is going well, and I hope everyone's enjoying their experience and enjoyed seeing the ship come in. And if you were able to take a tour already, I hope you enjoyed it. And if you haven't yet, hopefully you'll get a chance to see it after these lectures. And if not, it's going to be on display at regular museum hours from here on out, unless we happen to go away, which we will in a couple weeks, to Annapolis. So our first outreach trip will be to the second capital. Thought that might be fitting. And then at the end of October, the first time ever, and might be one of the only times we ever get to do this, is go to the Downrigging Festival for the Sultana in Chestertown. And of course, this will be the new ship's first time going to Blessing of the Fleet. So for all the locals, that is a really nice treat, where a ceremony to bless the fishing boats and the crab boats and all that. And so we're part of that at St. Clemens Island, which is where Dove in 1634 set for a little bit. And then we'll do some more tours next year. But for now, let's talk more about the build, the design. We haven't had this lecture here. We've done parts of this over at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum as part of our collaborations with educational programs. I see a number of our friends from across the bay, and so thank you for coming and continuing to enjoy the day with us. And I will hand it off to Captain Will Gates to introduce everyone and lead on the lecture.
Thanks, Peter, and let me also thank and congratulate Peter for organizing today's events. We're really indebted for. I've had so much going on that I certainly couldn't, and thank you, Peter, for all your support. So this is a panel conversation between the designer, myself, and the head rigger for the construction of the new Dove. And I just want to lead off with a little reminder, with kind of a review of why we built a new vessel. It was a process that's been coming for 20 years, actually, ever since we identified that the old vessel was either going to need a major rebuild, which would have taken it offline and interrupted our programs for a year or many, as well as of course the cost of such a repair. So we've known this was coming on for a number of years. We found rot in the stern post, and then we found rot in the stem. We convinced the Coast Guard that it was still safe to sit at the dock, and we weren't going to sink at the dock with visitors on board. We made repairs, and of course, it has turned out the repairs have been pretty robust. They've been pretty long-lived, and indeed the vessel has still been able to do modest campaigning in the recent years, although having been pumping 10 inches of water out of her every day through the spring, we've grounded her. She's on the dock for the duration at this point, the old Dove. Dear old girl, we love her, but our program has changed, and I'm going to bring Peter back because, see, this morning at the earlier presentation, he did such a nice synopsis of the difference in the design of the old versus what we wish for in the new. Peter, come on back and kind of repeat that rationale, if you would.
Okay. So when we began this process, one of the things I started doing was going through the records of the museum and basically understanding why decisions were made in the 1970s to build what was built ultimately for our ship, and found, and we kind of knew this, but the intent was not to build a 1634 vessel. It was to focus on the late 17th century tobacco fleet, and named in honor of the ship in 1634. And so that's where a lot of the confusion has come from. Both stories are wonderful to tell. They're both valid to tell. But the visitor kept asking about the voyage and wanting to know about the voyage, and we'd always have to explain why this ship doesn't represent that voyage and the differences, especially, the crew difference. The 1634 was a crew of 7. We need at least 9 to run the 1978 ship, so that's a huge difference right there. And it is a fascinating story to learn about Richard Orchard and Leonard Calvert sailing up to meet with Wanis and going to Boston and getting banned from Boston, which I didn't talk too much about, and that's for a whole other
Dove crew
lecture.
banned in Boston.
Yes. So
It probably would happen today as well.
Yep. And another thing that came about, sorry to go into a little bit of the weeds here, but museums, there's an accreditation organization, the American Alliance of Museums. And when we did our accreditation, one of the things they pointed out was we juggle so much time here, it's hard for the general public person to understand all this time. Us, like Henry Miller, myself, we're fine bouncing back one decade to the next, but it's hard for the next person. So part of the idea was let's focus a little bit in the early 1630s time period, and then have other places that can focus on the later half. And so with our Woodland Indian Hamlet, it was only natural that we should have a 1634 Dove, and that's one of the things that we wanted to do. So that's where we decided to go with the story. And I think I didn't say it in my remarks earlier, but I have to say kudos to the research department, because hand in glove, they found the fort from 1634, and so that really ties everything together even more, and so it makes it feel even more right to have this vessel to interpret that time period. So a little bit different than what I talked about. I hope that was okay.
That's good.
All right, back to Will.
Sure.
Nice work.
So the new Dove represents our best current understanding of what the 1634 Dove might have been, might have looked like. We are going to be the first to say that there are any number of variations that it could have been. And so we have a consensus of opinions in as much as William A. Baker, who designed the 1978 Dove, with different marching orders, different premises. William A. Baker's opinion in his 1980 publication was that the Dove of 1634 probably was a Dutch Boyer. What's that, you ask? Well, Ivor's about to show us some drawings, and I think Sam will too, and photos of Dutch masters' artwork that describe the Boyer as a handy, maneuverable coastal cargo craft of the sort that we know many of the voyages of exploration in the 1500s and colonization in the 1600s traveled in fleets with a large vessel as the mothership for the supplies, the passengers, the soldiers, most of the personnel, most of the supplies would be on the larger vessels, and the smaller vessels were brought to provide transportation once they got here. In the early years for exploring, in the later years for local transportation, carrying goods. And this is indeed exactly what happened with the Maryland colony. 1634, the Dove stayed and was used to travel the bay through the summer. By the end of the summer, they had a surplus of corn. I think the first colony to have a surplus in their first year of arrival. And then travel to New England and back. So what did we want in this new vessel? So as one would when one designs a building, you get all the users together, you find out what everybody wants, you put your specifications together, your list of goals and I wants, and then you go to the naval architect, the poor naval architect, and you give him all these conflicting needs and desires and ask him to make it work. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ivor Franzen, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how he tried to give us as much of our cake as we could have and eat it too.
Okay.
All right, let's hear it for Ivor Franzen.
Can you all hear me back there without a microphone? No? I was afraid you were going to say that. All right. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Oops. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. Yeah, as Will mentioned, actually, I'm going to start with the thought that earlier today on board the Dove, as we were coming over, I was having a chat with the young lady from MPT who was doing some filming and some discussing of various things with the crew on board. And one of the questions she asked me was, well, you know, sort of how did this all start with you? And the first thing that popped into my head was conversations I had with Bill Dudley and a couple of folks at CDMM. And this would have been sometime in 2018, I think. And I realized afterwards that the first conversation I had about this project was with Captain Will in Annapolis in about 2015, 16, somewhere around there. So this had been percolating for quite a long time, even for me. So with that said, as Will alluded to, there are a lot of things that go into a design of any sort, and yeah, it's kind of a juggling act. It's a bit of a puzzle. There's a lot of things that go into a design to make sure it all works. And of course, the first step in that is the research, and that, of course, was also a great team effort. A lot of it started with your associate
Joe Greeley.
20
years ago.
Started doing a lot of good work on that, so that was a good genesis for what came after. And Sam will touch on this in a little while. A lot of one of the problems with designing something from that time period is they didn't do, there wasn't stuff we could copy. They didn't draw lines back then. They didn't do all that kind of stuff back then. There was a lot of holding up of thumbs and squinting of eyes and that kind of thing. So you often don't have a lot to go on when it comes time to do that research. So where's the button that advances you have the button, or is the button here?
It is that one.
That button. Okay. So the previous slide indicated, of course, the basic balls that one juggles. This is actually most of the balls that get juggled during the design process. And I realized after I sent this in that I had actually forgotten a couple more, and I've since forgotten what they are. Maybe they'll occur to me as I go along here. But at any rate, starting over on the right. Or beg your pardon, the left as you're looking at it, research involved, so we what type of hull does she have, what type of rig did she have, and how do we know all of that? Sam's going to show you some artwork that a lot of this is based on. Because, like I said, we didn't have a whole lot else. There are some writings and some treatises that were done back then, a few logs from various ships that may or may not apply, and you have to fight your way through those to see if they apply. One of the problems with artwork, there's some wonderful artwork that comes out of that period, but the trick is to find out and determine how knowledgeable the artist was about ships and sailing. They could paint a beautiful picture, and many of them did. But if they had never sailed, well, who knows what the painting's going to show. So the trick is to find those artists that actually knew something about sailing and actually did sail. One of our favorites was a fellow named Nooms. What was Nooms' first name? I can't remember either. Anyhow, Mr. Nooms was he was a professional sailor, and he sailed during this time period, and later on became during and after was a terrific artist, did some great artwork. And the only problem with Mr. Nooms was that he was an alcoholic. So even there, we have to be a little bit careful. Well, all right, Was he having a good day or a bad day when he painted this? We think he was having a good day most of the time. So then we move on to those conversations that a designer has with the client, and we come into the client requirements. These are the requirements that I was handed. I don't know if you can read those, starting upper left in the middle group, no more than 65 feet on deck. Now, we already knew that it was going to be somewhat shorter than that on deck, but 65 feet is a regulatory breakpoint we did not want to exceed for that breakpoint. Going beyond that breakpoint, things get much more complicated. Maximum displacement of 70 long tons. That was a practical issue having to do with haul outs and maintenance. Maximum draft of 7 feet fully loaded. There are places that your ship has to go into as part of her program that if she drew more than 7 feet and you went in there at high tide with a load of passengers and you sort of forgot that the tide was going out, all of a sudden you're at the very least you're stuck there with a boat full of passengers until the next high tide, or you get stuck on the sandbar. Both of those are to be avoided. There was a desire to keep as reasonably close as possible the hull profile of the present Dove. So that was, and speaking of which, getting back to research a little bit, as Will pointed out, there are a number of different variations on the Boyer workboat configuration. Some of which have the raised quarterdecks, as we do on this ship, some which, and quite a few did not. They both qualify as Boyers. The Boyer designation refers to the rig as much as anything else. I did find in my research a wreck that was discovered in the Baltic. The wreck was discovered back in the 60s, I believe, and the drawing of that, if you look at the profile of the drawing of that, is a dead ringer for the Maryland Dove. And it was determined to be a true Boyer. Maximum air draft of 64 feet. Every once in a while, she'll need to go under some fixed bridges. And tell them I said hi. And most fixed bridges in this part of the world are 65 feet. And the present Dove has twin engines, and everybody decided it was a good idea to hold with that and put twin engines in the new boat as well. See, I think I'm already running out of time, so I'll hustle through the rest of them. All right, so that's the basic ship in terms of what the client wanted. Anything I'm forgetting at this point in terms of the list of ingredients?
That's most of it. Had to have a bathroom.
Had to have a bathroom. We call them heads on boats. What else? A couple other odds and ends, but nothing. Well, okay, escape hatches. That gets over into Group C on the right-hand side of the slide. You'll notice there are more bubbles over there, more balls to juggle over there than perhaps some of the other balls to juggle, other groups. Every one of those balls represents a separate approval that needed to be achieved from Coast Guard. So it wasn't just the Coast Guard saying, "Okay, looks good. Here's your certificate." No, they want to see everything, every aspect of the design. So I'll rattle off the balls in a hurry. Systems, exhaust systems, spar review, structurals. There it says structurals per Lloyd's. Lloyd's is one of the rule sets. Lloyd's Yacht and Small Craft is one of the rule sets that the Coast Guard uses to review most of the aspects of designs that are going to be certified. That particular rule set is quite complete, and it's pretty much a soups to nuts rule set. And that rule set does cover structural analyses, engineering, machinery, exhausts. Most of what you see up there is covered by yachts and small craft. So we got shafts and struts, the rigging review. That's the one thing that rule set does not do. The Norwegians are still in the process of putting together a rigging review guide, but here in this country there really isn't one, so that has to be done by first principles. Rudder and steering, machinery and propulsion, electrical, safety equipment, general arrangement. Safety equipment and general arrangement sound pretty similar, but they're actually two different things. One is safety equipment is pretty specifically targeted towards, fire extinguishers and life rafts and all that other stuff that is very directly safety related. General arrangement is, they just sort of want to see that everything, they want to see what the overall arrangement is in terms of various systems and structures, but including safety equipment. And last but not least, in the lower right-hand corner, stability. It is a pretty proven fact that the great majority of vessels from this time period right up through the mid-19th century, the great majority of those, if they were subjected today to the Coast Guard stability requirements in 46 CFR subchapter S, all those ships would fail. So this is a wrinkle we run into with every representational ship design. In that, if you and this is a mistake that is made, that it's not made so much anymore because everybody's pretty aware of this now. But for quite a few years, sort of in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of representational ships were built. The drawings and lines would be found at the Smithsonian or someplace, and they would essentially be copied to make that replica. And that's when you can really call it a true replica. Well, that's fine. You get a true replica. Problem is, they all, to a greater or lesser extent, ran into stability issues. So nowadays, we have to pay a lot more attention to well, you really can't just copy the lines and copy the design out of and just go from there. You really need to make certain adjustments either in the hull shape or in the ballasting or in the sail plan or all of the above, which is really what ends up happening. So all of those need tweaking and adjustments and thinking, and how's it all going to go together to make a stable vessel and still be proper representation. That's why we make the distinction nowadays between replicas and representations. Replicas, a true replica may not pass stability, but a representational vessel with the various adjustments that we make to make stability work, now we stand a pretty good chance of having things work. And in this case, it did. That's enough of the juggling act for now. I'll show you two drawings just to give you an idea of some of the things we might have done. For example, in ballasting, traditionally, ballasting in a ship like this, any replica ship is going to be just in the bilges. In the old days, it was cobblestones. More recently, it's leading. It's inside the boat, down, laid in this area here. Well, in more recent representations that I've been involved with, Pride 2, Nickel are good examples, and we've done a couple of those this way. We've actually added lead to the keel structure. So this dark area here is additional lead ballast, which works very well because it gets the ballast lower, so you may not need either quite as much, or if you decide, well, I do want this much ballast, but I want it to be more effective, it's more effective the lower it gets. So nowadays we're doing this treatment pretty universally. All of this over here, obviously I can't read it, and well, hell, I can't read it from here. But those are about a third of just the structural calculations that I had to do for Lloyd's yacht and small craft, for just the structural part of the review process, and this gives you a little more idea of what's going on. This is another third of those calculations. These are cross-section views now, of course. This is the midship section, and again, here's that dark area there. That's the lead ballast that we bolted on to the bottom of the keel to get that portion of the ballast lower in the boat. The rest of the ballast is in this space here, is in the bilges under the sole. This being the sole. Sole is a fancy nautical word for floor. In a ship, however, floors are actually something different. So that gives you a general idea of some of the hoops that needed to be jumped through to make sure that the whole design worked in order to achieve that. And there you have it. That document down in the lower right-hand corner, I could not resist the urge to stick that in there. That is the new Coast Guard certificate. I think that's a good place for me to wind up. All right, I will introduce Sam Hilgard. I have a terrible time. Say it again. Hilgardner. He'll correct it when he gets up here. But he is the chief rigger on this project. I'll let him tell you where he's from. But he's done a hell of a job with putting all this together. And I will turn it over to Peter and to Sam.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Awesome. So, my name is Sam Hilgartner. I've been involved in this project actually since 2018. The last time that I was here at St. Mary's was, I believe, in June or July 2018. And we met with Will Gates, Peter, Joe Kangas, Steve Burns, our VP, Joe Connor, the lead shipwright, Michael Gorman, the old shipyard manager at CBMM, and we were just sitting down to discuss the possibility of this, what the boat might look like, and it really seemed like, oh yeah, maybe this will happen, but it's one of those things where at CBMM we do usually engage a number of projects kind of far into the future, and maybe they'll flesh out, maybe they'll pan out for us. Right now we've got nothing as glorious as this, but we have some really cool projects, but there's always like 4 or 5 floating, and maybe you catch 2 or 3 of them. So it's amazing that, I'm here now 4 years later, and there's this ship floating down there at the dock, and and she's Coast Guard certified. So we had a volunteer walk by the ship, and he looked at me, and I was working on some rigging, and this is the Dove, the new Dove. And he just looked at me. He's an older volunteer. He's kind of sage-like. He's actually a name board carver, and he's like 95, and he's like this tall. And he just looked at me and he said, "When will the Dove arrive?" And I was like, I thought it was like sort of a philosophical kind of metaphysical question. Like, does he mean like, when is the ship going to be finished, or when will the vessel come into its fullest like constituted form? And he actually meant the figurehead, which is a dove on the bow of the vessel, so far less interesting. But the question stuck with me. So all right, I'm going to start. I'm going to give myself about 20 minutes here. I've got a slide-heavy presentation, a lot of photos, so hopefully that'll be fun. And I'll be using this laser pointer as well. I do apologize. Rigging is one of these things that it's jargon heavy, and it's hard to simplify or to kind of try to explain the terminology quickly, because the best way to explain something is to relate it to something else. And in the rigging, you're relating some technical jargon to something else that has some technical jargon. So hopefully I will, people who are not as familiar with ships or boats and rigging will kind of understand what I'm talking about. But my goal is also to engage people who do know a lot about the subject. So I'm not going to read everything on my slides, and I'm doing that intentionally. The slides are going to be a little bit more technical. So if you're someone who is there and you're capable of understanding this terminology, you're welcome to kind of read through the slides, and hopefully you'll get a little bit more. Otherwise, I'll try to make it as accessible as possible. So a little bit of this has been covered, but I have a slightly different perspective on it just because I'm primarily concerned with the rig. The reason why it's important to think about the crew is because a crew size to some degree determines the complexity of the rig. So if you have a rig that's highly complex, you're going to require a bigger crew. A really big 3-masted late 19th century windjammer or something could have a gargantuan crew of like 80 people or something like that. So the difference between 9 or 10 and 7 is substantial with small vessels. So the current vessel, it's Will Gates and the crew over time have realized that it takes more than 7 to sail this vessel. So the rig most likely was a little bit more simple. I'm not going to go over all of this, but obviously the vessel made an ocean passage, so that also to some degree limits factors of the design of the hull and the rig. There were near coastal vessels in the time period that were very neat but unlikely to see, making an ocean passage. We also know that she was capable of sailing around in the Chesapeake Bay and up and down the coast a couple times. So I'm looking at a lot of paintings. So the reason why is because there are so many details and different what we call typology of pieces of hardware, things like blocks, dead eyes, and they might seem like minutia, but when you consider all of the minutia of detail in a ship, that is in the end what will come to leave an impression on the visitor or on the individual who's sailing the vessel. So none of it's trivial to me. So I'm really interested in every little detail. So I'm looking at models, paintings, artifacts in the archaeological record. Joe Connor and I, the lead shipwright, were privileged enough to be able to go and look at the Vasa and look at her collection and work with their chief of research, who, even though it's the Vasa Museum, there's one vessel, the Vasa, he's actually been the lead excavator and surveyor of maritime wrecks in the Baltic and North Sea in the 17th century. So he has a really vast knowledge of the time period. We got a lot working with him. We're also learning from experimental archaeology, which is the use of replicas or reproduction to learn how they might have worked in that time period. I'm looking at some treatises, some historical studies as well. So just a little collection of some of the research that I have used in my development of some of the details in the rigging for the Maryland Dove. I would say I referenced probably about 10 books, and kind of in the thick of it, I kept these books on my work table, and I would look at them, any time in the day. I'd probably open 2 or 3 books a day for little details. As Ivor mentioned, the paintings are really important. Obviously, we don't have photos. We have some great, they're not all paintings, we have etchings, prints. As Ivor mentioned as well, we don't really have drawn lines. Sometimes you might see a really simple drawing representing some stations, or maybe a profile of a ship. There's some really good technical drawings by Van de Velde, the Elder. He's got some incredible technical drawings of hulls from the kind of more mid-17th century. So I'm looking at a lot of actually late 16th century, because the Dove most likely was early 17th century. We don't know when. Maybe it could have been 16 teens. So I'm really interested in the late 15, early 1600s. There's not much there's so much in the 1600s. The Van de Velde family, the elder and younger, have really detailed drawings. So let's see if this works. So what I'm looking at here, so we've got, these are mostly Van de Velde. Cornelius von Klaas is the bottom here, and you can see a lot of sprit rig vessels. Here's a Boyer right here I'm circling. You can see the little mizzen back aft with a lateen sail, and you can see this mainsail with a sprit. All of these boats here are sprit rigs. And then here's some Mediterranean galleys and things coming in on the right. This is Boethius, really cool painter, lots of interesting. It's unusual to see maritime work, but here's another, what might be a Boyer, it might just be a single masted vessel with a big flagstaff back aft, but also useful. So I've pored over these paintings over the years to look for details and clues. This is an image of some of the archaeological research and evidence. You can see here at the top, this is a cable, which is like a rope. It's usually 3 ropes laid up together to make a larger piece of cordage, which is called a cable. That's actually from the Vasa. This is very interesting. This is a piece of canvas fragment from the Vasa's small boat. So we actually were interested in Vasa's small boat because it was a sprit rig vessel. It's even though we call it a small boat, it's a pretty large vessel, closer to the size of the Dove than the Vasa is. And it's got, for the nerds out there, it's got this continuous grommet. So rather than there being a small grommet laid up for things like row bands and lashings, it's got this one continuous piece of marlin that makes a loop. It's very unique. Never seen anything like that, but apparently it was somewhat common. We've got some dead eyes. There are a number of common shapes, and some of this changes depending on what region of the world you're in. Scandinavia, there might be some differences, although the Vasa had a Dutch lead shipwright, and the Dutch were the biggest influence in shipbuilding in the north. So yeah, lots of cool details. This is a great masthead. This looks like a later vessel, but it isn't. It's actually the topmast and to'gallant mast section of a model from the 1620s. So that's really, really useful. And then this is from a maritime historian, Hoving, Ab Hoving from the Amsterdam Maritime Museum. He made a lot of these really cool computer renderings and models of common ships of the period. Let's see here. So I'm kind of always trying to think in my build approach. I'm trying to think somewhat philosophically, which really means I'm just trying to think on principle. So rather than think like, maybe we should do this here or that there, thinking, okay, what are our principles? What is our sort of guide for this process? What takes precedence over something else? So some of this is covered by Ivor, and this is generally in my interpretation. So safety taking precedence over history. So if there's something that is historically accurate, but it's considered to be unsafe in the practice of the vessel, we might try to accommodate that in some form, but not to its complete form. The regulatory requirements usually take precedence over history or historical fact. History takes precedence over optimization and sailing performance in most cases. So obviously, this vessel is never going to sail as well as Pride of Baltimore 2 or America 2.0 or America's Cup yacht because it's an early 17th century replica vessel. So we try to make sure it works well and properly, but you can only expect so much performance. And then operation costs take precedence over material accuracy. So the vessel has some tropical hardwood, it's got some bronze fasteners, it's got synthetic ropes, things like this. They're going to last a lot longer, they're going to be easier to maintain. So I think about this philosophically. There are what are called the forms, Aristotle's forms, and these are used actually often in historical restoration. It's kind of a neat way to think about a historic fabric or a site or an object. So you can think about the material cause, which is what it's made of. Formal cause is the design. final cause is how it works, what it does, and then there's an efficient cause, which is how it's made. And something has historical value usually because of one of those factors, if not two or three. So something's historically significant because it was made with this certain material, and that's really interesting. In the case of Edna Lockwood down near the Dove, she's got these loblolly logs, and that's something you wouldn't really surrender. Whereas there are other vessels which, they're planked out of oak, but there's nothing maybe interesting about the oak, so you ask yourself, okay, I could also plank this up with Angelique. That's not really what, that's not the essence of this thing. So I'm always thinking, okay, are we sacrificing the essence of this vessel with a certain decision that we might make? So what is rigging? Okay, so rigging generally, you can think of it as when you're on a sailing vessel, you're standing on the deck. It's everything that you see when you start looking up. That's pretty simplified. It also includes some hull attachments and things like this. It is kind of a hard to define word because even in rigging, there's kind of a category which is rigging. But rigging, broadly speaking, includes the spar build, which are things like masts, booms, gaffs, sprits. It includes the blocks, which are the pulleys. We call them blocks, a block and tackle. The sails, obviously, hopefully everyone knows what a sail is. The standing and running rigging. The standing rigging are the pieces of rope that are less dynamic and that aren't used to manipulate sails. They're used to transfer load away from the sails and mast to the hull. That's what we call standing rigging. Running rigging are the things we haul on, hoist. It includes, this is almost a separate trade within the trade, the uprig. The uprig is the installation of everything, which includes or necessitates the lifting of very heavy objects and potentially moving their load from one part of the vessel to another, sometimes using the ship's gear or using a crane or forklift. And then it includes the deck furniture or hull interactions, which is just how does the rig attach to the vessel. And design as well. So, yeah, that's, just to go over kind of quickly, I don't want to lose people on terminology. So hopefully some of us, now that we know what a rig is, there's generally two categories of rig. There's a fore and aft rig and a square rig, and sometimes a vessel might fit somewhere in between. So this is really neat. This is actually from 1585, and it is a Boyer. And this is from Wagner, who William Baker studied. And William Baker studied these drawings that are from a chart when he was thinking about what the Dove might look like in some of his research. So if you look at any of Baker's books, you'll see some kind of simplified line drawings of Boyers, and a lot of them are from these charts. This was kind of a trend in the 16th century, late 16th century, to have these sort of fanciful charts. It didn't last very long. It actually only started in like the 1550s, and it kind of died out as a trend in chart drawing. But you see a bunch of these really cool, cute little kind of coasting craft and smaller fore and aft rigs. Fore and aft rig refers to the sail plan. So if primarily your sails run along the fore and aft line of the vessel, which just means forward and aft when you're standing on the vessel, the sails are going to be in line with that kind of imaginary line, then it's a fore and aft rig if they're primarily oriented that way. You see these big, larger vessels here. It's a warship. You see all these square sails, which are literally the big square sails. They're actually called square rig, not because the sails are square, but because the yards, when the vessel is in its, when the sails are furled and the vessel is kind of in its show form, those yards are all square to the vessel, and it's square rigged. You could have a sail that's square shaped, but it could be a fore and aft sail like a lug sail or something. So this is just to show some difference in the time. So I spent a lot of time looking for gaffs. A lot of us kind of wanted the Dove to be gaff rig because we're familiar with gaff rigs. People have sailed gaff rigs. The gaff is this spar that you see on this vessel back here. Is actually supposed to be the yacht of Charles II. Famously, some people call it the first yacht. It wasn't the first yacht. There were yachts before this. It's the sail right here. The top of the sail is stretched out. We call it the head of the sail is stretched out by a gaff, which is a certain type of spar. And we think it probably came around into the in around 1650. So it would have been really nice if we saw lots of paintings and drawings with gaff rigs in the 16 teens or 1630s, but we really don't. Certainly possible that we might have had one, but pretty unlikely. You see a lot of sprit rigs. So both of these have quadrilateral mainsails. This big sail, the dominant sail, is not quite square. It's kind of like a trapezoid. And the earlier form had this big spar that spread the head of that sail out, which is called a sprit pole. And this type of sail is a sprit-rigged sail, but we would call this the mainsail. Whereas this one doesn't have that spar going across, splitting the sail. It's just got a little spar on the top of the head of the sail, which is called a gaff. And the way they work is similar, but there's challenges related to the sprit. The Boyer is generally thought to be this type of rig. It might have been called a hoy. There's a couple of other terms that you see in the English literature, but there's sometimes a hoy lacks that little mizzen mast. So the first thing that we started working on are the spars, and it makes sense to work on the spars first. Because that is going to inform a little bit more as to how the rigging terminates, the sails terminate. So I was involved with a project a few years ago where we built the whole rig and none of the spars were built yet, and it was a more modern vessel with steel bands and things, attachment points for sails. It was really, it's really unwise to do that. It's best to have the spars all ready before you build the rig. So Now is going to be kind of the fun, fast part. I'm going to show a lot of slides of the build. And if anyone later has questions about the build, it's going to be a little nerdy, a little technical, but please ask. So the spars start on the sawmill. They start mostly as solid. We have a couple laminated spars. These are the tools for spar construction. We, at the Maritime Museum, I talked about this idea of the efficient calls, how something is built. So at the CBMM, we are not a living history museum, so we're not ever building something to demonstrate how it was done in the period. So we are a working shipyard, and we're using any tool that is useful to us. So we don't have a wind-powered gang saw, we're not out there. And the other thing that's interesting about that is in the 17th century, they were a lot further ahead than we realized. They already had huge sawmills. It wasn't Viking boat building at all. But, we're using modern tools, which also include hand tools. Still plenty of hand tools. You can see some small, actually a large jack plane on the top right there. Matt Hommel building the topmast. Got a bunch of spars coming along here, some in the shop. Looks like the topmast, the boomkin, the lower yard on the right. You can see a bunch of varnished spars with what we call puddings, which protect the spar and the mast from their interaction with one another. This was our bird's mouth spar, the only bird's mouth spar. It's hollow. It's a really fun, tricky, kind of finicky thing to build. Bob Downs, who I'm definitely indebted to. He's an amazing rigger. He was my compadre, my right-hand man for this project. So this is the sprit. This is the big sprit when you're down at the Dove and you see that big spar. That's the sprit, and it's gigantic. It's 52 feet long. It weighs 350 pounds. It would have weighed a whole lot more than that if it weren't hollow. It does have some filled spots in it, though. It's not completely hollow. We've got the main mast coming along here, the big thumb getting mortised in. There's the crazy joinery that I don't know why we decided to make this so complicated, although that thing is going to be around forever. That's on the left. It's this gigantic doubling cap that goes on top of the main mast. Proud Bob. Here you can see the cross trees We use a lot of what we call compass timbers, timbers that are grown with the grain being oriented to the desired design of the piece that we want to build. These are live oak cross trees and white oak trestle trees going fore and aft. These are when you look up in the boat, you see the kind of, looks like a little sort of platform going across. Call them cross trees. So the blocks were really fun to build. We built 1 million of them. We actually did build 160 blocks, which are, again, like the pulleys. And they were made out of all local materials exclusively. White ash from Kent County, Maryland, and Osage orange from Queen Anne's County, Maryland, which we harvested all of. So that was cool as well. We went out into the field. These were all live trees, dropped them all, dried them in a solar kiln, build them out. So here's some just getting to work out in the yard, dicing up some white ash. Got some white ash blocks coming along here. A lot of hand tooling, a lot of power tooling. Because we made so many, we did do this sort of in an assembly style. So this isn't like, okay, I'm making one block, that one's finished, let's make the next one. We're going through the process of construction. Here's all the blocks finished, quite a few. They're pretty much all on the boat. There's a few extras of the common sizes, so you can see some kind of unusual blocks at the bottom. Here and there, there's some kind of cool shapes. We didn't make extras of those, but of all the other ones, we made a few extras. The dead eyes are when you're looking at the vessel, you see the shrouds, which go up to the mast. Those are these, they're what would be turnbuckles on a modern boat. They allow you to tension the shrouds, and they look like that. Here we are, sort of, I wouldn't quite call this forging. We're bending bronze strapping around the lower dead eyes. Here we got some hardware coming together. So again, the rigging includes everything you see from the hull up, including a lot of spar hardware. So all the spars have cleats and thumbs and things like this to hold the rigging on. And all of this is, these little cleats and things, I think we also probably made 100 of these little things. So the sails were subcontracted out by Maine Rigging and Sails, Dale Ward, really awesome sail maker who worked with the famous Nat Wilson. She learned her trade. It's Oceanus canvas, which is like a synthetic woven canvas. It resembles cotton. It's pretty much the most common modern traditional canvas, tried and true. Here we are picking up the sails in Maine, February 2021. So Bob and I drove up there. We had a fun little time. Bending on sail on the top yard. That's the big square topsail. So this is close to the end here. The running rigging. Running rigging and standing rigging, like I said, that's what people usually think of when they think of rigging. It's all the ropes and all these kinds of things. We used a lot of different materials for different applications. The materials, the types of rope all have different properties. There's not just one type of rope on the vessel. They're mostly ropes provided by a company called Longmans in the Netherlands. They make really high quality modern traditional ropes. There's lots of leather in the rig. Here's some pieces of rigging coming along here. These are all finished pieces. You can see some cool leather work. We've got some sheet pennants for the spritsail, brace pennants for the lower yard. It's a splice. So all these splices are mostly covered up with service, which is the stuff that you see kind of going around the stay here. That's called service. This is a splice. That's how you create a loop in the end of a piece of rope or a piece of rigging. Bunch of pieces finished, coming together. And there's that put-in coming along. We basically made a loom to make these. It was pretty fun. Some big cat blocks. They hang off the cat heads. They kind of hold the anchors up in a way. Big, heavy blocks. This is the big forestay. It's the biggest stay on the vessel. It's really cool. It's called a sonai. It's not a splice. It's something I'd never done before. It didn't last for very long. It was kind of a trend for about 150 years. It actually went into the 18th century a little bit. making these sonais. It's a huge one. It's got this crazy covering on it. It takes forever to do this. It seems totally unnecessary, but you see it in every single model. Every single model, it's like it was ubiquitous. It was everywhere in the time period. Actually, the Dove maybe should have a little bit more of this kind of thing even, but it is very time consuming. This is grafting, which is also just weaving. There's a warp and a weft, just like the cotton pants or jeans. It's at finish before it gets tarred. So that's the big forestay with the big the big tapered thing is called a mouse. It plugs into that little eye and it creates a really big eye. Deck furniture, self-explanatory. Live oak, white oak, kind of fun to build. Some up-rig photos. So this is the rig coming together. I'll leave this here in case you want to read. So again, this is kind of the last stage now. Everything's built. We're about to put the mast in, and we've got the team assembled. We've got the crane. And after this, you begin the process of basically securing all of the rigging and bending on sail, getting it to the point where you can go sailing. Here's the crew, Becca, Bob, myself, getting ready to get that main mast up. You can see all the leather, a lot of leather on this rig. Got the bowsprit coming in, big jib stay coming on, team Becca and Sam there. Get the lower yard on, crossing the lower yard. You can see the topmast up in the middle, the topmast not up on the left. So at that point you have no ratlins or rapports. So every time you climb aloft, you have to use arborist gear and climb aloft on a single rope. It's kind of fun. Big sprit, getting hoisted up. Really easy, a lot easier than we thought. There's a view from aloft of a lot of the gear, how it sits on the masthead there, so gets complicated. A lot going on. That's just one kind of small area of the boat. Mizzen mast. Mizzen mast is very simple. Probably everyone has noticed. It's very small. Here we've got climbing aloft, working on very patriotic, working on some rat boards or something. And then sea trials. So making sure everything works and actually celebrating after realizing that everything did work. We didn't really have to make any big changes. I really anticipated there being something like, oh man, that did not work how I thought it would. I thought that would be a part of this. I thought there'd be 2 or 3 things that really would foul me up. And things pretty much came along. We took her out 4 or 5 times before handing her over to St. Mary's City. Just a trialer, get all the sails shaken out, make sure everything works. I actually don't know off the top of my head. Do you know, Ivor? Yeah, it's not much.
It's on one of my slides.
Yeah, it is. So, the concluding remarks for me, if anyone is a builder or interested in building, I would say this applies to anyone interested in construction or in building. I learned a lot of lessons on this project. Staying organized for rigging is critical. I have a lot of spreadsheets. I've probably annoyed the lead shipwright, Joe Connor, a few times working on my spreadsheets. I do have a tendency to be kind of conservative and to trust the history and to trust the research rather than to try to be too clever and to try to think of something that, to me might make sense. Well, why would I do that when I have dozens of paintings that show it done another way? Even if I can't imagine, why do they do it like that? I see it everywhere, but I can't think of why they do it that way. It's like, well, let's try it. Let's see how it works. Material quality, a lot of people are really hung up on this thing of using solid spars everywhere, even when the material they have is trash, and people are really hesitant towards using laminated spars. So we have a couple quartered laminated spars that are solid. They are laminated, but you get beautiful quarter sawn pieces, and you have vertical grain going all the way around. That big bird's mouth spar, we did it for a lot of reasons, but if we did want to make it solid, we wouldn't have had the material. And when you look at that bird's mouth spar, you see perfect vertical grain all the way around. It's just amazing. make sure that the spars and sails and standing rigging are in harmony. I kind of mentioned that with building the spars first. I have this little mantra: perfectionism is procrastination masquerading as quality control. And Bob and I both, like, it was for us, because Bob and I could get really hung up on things. But Bob once spent, I think, like 2 or 2.5 weeks building a set of sawhorses, and that was like, I mean, they're really nice sawhorses. But, the process will save you from the poverty of your idea. So sometimes you just have to go. It's like, okay, enough thinking. We're going. We're building. We're doing this. Just get into it. Festina lentes Latin means make haste slowly. It's kind of seems like a contradiction, but it really means be careful, work with expedience. That's pretty much it. So I look forward to questions later on. I appreciate everyone's attention. Sorry I went a little bit over, but I'll hand it over to Will. Thank you.
Is everyone good? Yeah. All right.
We can take a short break if we need to.
We are a little over, but I think
Okay.
everyone's enjoying it.
Well,
Okay.
I don't have a lot more to say. So I did want to talk a little bit about what we hope to do with the new ship. And of course, we're still going to keep doing our dockside education program, which is currently our main program with the ship, and a very successful program, and we're going to keep that going. We, of course, the big reason to have her Coast Guard certified is to be able to do fundraising. I was continually frustrating the membership coordinators and the fundraisers when they would want me to bring a guest on board that they were grooming for a high level of membership or for certain favors, things that they could do for the commission. And I told them flat out, there can be no quid pro quo, because what the Coast Guard interprets as a passenger is anyone who provides any compensation for passage. If you say, bring the beer and we'll go for a sail, they're a passenger because they paid for that sail with beer. So I've been very strict with the commission throughout my 33 years. I have a Coast Guard license. I want to maintain that license. I don't want to lose it. So as a consequence, the new ship had to be Coast Guard certified. And so now we will be able to do an evening sail with the 1634 members, or take the trustees for a sail, take whomever Dr. Fodden and the development director want to take for a sail. They can now, if they choose, link that sail to whatever compensation that individual provides. It's entirely likely that in the new season, once we have the crew up and trained and have our protocols together, that we will do a series of perhaps a series of evening sails, evening and afternoon sails on a given weekend, and then transfer back into dockside mode for the rest of the month. Once a month, have a weekend that will involve several sails. This is the model that we're working on as we go forward. One can also envision underway education programs. And again, these are things that we will consider. We're going to look at each proposed new program and look at the costs and benefits and see what will work for the Commission's purposes. And so there are any number of programs other vessels are doing. We're not going to try to duplicate their market niche, but there are things that we represent here, and there are lessons that we can teach that are appropriate for here that could be done as underway programs. And finally, just back to banging the drum that you hear me bang so often in terms of skill preservation. We're doing a program both in terms of building the ship itself, and today is kind of a conclusion of the build and what the build has done for us and what we specified and successfully achieved was that we built a ship in Maryland, and the process of building that ship brought in shipwrights and apprentices from all over the country and has helped pass on the knowledge, Sam's knowledge, Ivor's knowledge, Joe Connor's knowledge, knowledge of shipwright Frank Townsend, who have been able to teach others and learn from each other. So what was going on here was both Tall Ship Kindergarten, in terms of volunteers and individuals who have little or no experience starting in and getting some basics, but you also had Tall Ship Graduate School, because Sam worked with another very fine rigger, Bob, who you saw, and I don't know if you guys had worked together before, but I'll guarantee that the two of you learned from each other in this process, and each of you became a better rigger. Same happened for me when I was in Galveston, Texas on a project down there. We worked with Brian Toss from the West Coast, Steve Hyman from the West Coast, myself from the East Coast. We all learned from each other and came out of it more knowledgeable than we had been. We would not have had that opportunity if that project hadn't happened. And if it hadn't been such a big project that it required bringing in more than one master rigger. Same with this project again. The fact that it was big enough that Sam couldn't do it all by himself, but had to bring in others. You saw Captain Rose in one of those pictures. Becca, I forget Becca's last name, Buckler, who is a very accomplished rigger in her own right, has worked at Mystic, done other projects. So these projects, they only come every once a decade. For some of us, they come once in a career, or once every 20 years. But we achieved transferring knowledge between each other and to others by doing these projects. So bringing this benefit to Maryland was something that was important to us to achieve this. So. And of course, every day we're working with volunteers, we're working with interns from St. Mary's College and others, and we get to pass on this knowledge. So in doing so, we maintain this diversity of human knowledge using these obsolete techniques and skills, using these weird materials, which once again are becoming relevant. Sam will tell you in the field of yachting, Bob especially has worked with yacht rigging, and many of these techniques of using lanyards, analogous to your shoelace, how you tighten your shoe on your foot. You pull on a lanyard. Okay, we call it a shoestring. You pull a lanyard that tensions this device. Well, that is coming back into yacht rigging, because with modern fibers, they're now using flexible ropes rather than steel shrouds and stays and turnbuckles. And so now in yachting, they're often using stay set and other high-tech fibers and tightening them with lanyards, using 17th century techniques for modern yachts. Similarly, Ivor can probably tell you about modern projects, bridges, space stations, what have you, that are designed with concepts that come from 17th century rigging, or at least that were rooted in 17th century rigging. The apprentice that spent half the time halfway up the mast on Alyssa with me, turning in seizings on topmast stays, he became an engineer for NASA, helping to design space stations. I don't know that he used our knowledge in the space station, but I'm just saying, these are concepts that become that as outmoded and obsolete as they seem, they are again relevant. Or 50 years from now, as technology and the world changes, they may again become relevant. So here we are in a museum. We are the keepers of not only artifacts, but of ideas and technologies that we preserve for posterity. All right, my bandwagon. Sorry, folks. At any rate, you all have questions. I know some of you do.
Before we
Go ahead,
get
Peter.
into questions, something we haven't really done, and we kind of alluded to it earlier in the day, but Can I ask everyone here who worked on this project at Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum and Historic St. Mary City to please stand up? That includes you, Steve. You manage those weekly meetings. Now we can have questions.
All right. Tom Madej, start us off.
Okay, you've got a whole host of drawings and information that the men have described today. Where's all that going to be archived?
The question is, where will the drawings and information be archived? Of course, Ivor's office and his computers for the drawings. The several sets that he sent on to us that will be at least one full set of which will be in our museum archives. I will briefly admit that my office sometimes looks more like a junk shop than an archive, but yes.
So there's no plans right now to pull it together, to be able to say to somebody over in Europe at some point in time, they say, we'd like to build a ship from the 17th century. You know, where would we go? You know, at this point in time, it sounds like you'd stay in Maryland.
There's an intellectual property element there, but Ivor will explain.
Yeah, I have to be a little. Yeah, I can't just hand it out because there is a. It will be available for research for sure.
Okay.
In any design, whether it's a tall ship or a building or a modern vessel, there are it's just like the offer of a book. You've got
Even
you
though
have some protections there.
even though it was paid for by the state.
Copyright protections, yeah.
Even though it was paid for by the state, or that's,
Well, actually, the state would have an interest in. They wouldn't want to see that violated either. But that does not preclude, like I say, it does not preclude the research. Certainly doesn't preclude my involvement with them or Will's involvement. Anybody's involvement with them who's familiar with the project knows the project to help them along with their project. No, it's not. It's not a situation where. No, I'm sorry, it's mine, and nobody can see it anymore.
and I'm if I like my work experience.
You okay?
Yep.
But,
I don't know if the computer is.
Something I said?
Okay. Sorry.
maybe it's something I said. But you end up with all this great information, and at some point in time you're going to retire. Will's going to retire. All of a sudden.
I've heard that word bandied about.
Yeah, and he's counting down now almost. I'm going to be interested to ask him what his plans are. But,
Still not definite.
It's just scary to think that we've had a number of years going into this operation. That 20 years from now somebody says, hey, do we rebuild this new dove, or do we just go ahead and build a new one? And that an arrangement can certainly be arrived at that time. Depending on what the. But you won't be around to help with make the arrangements.
Well, that could be.
That's my question.
Sure.
It seems like
there may be some writing projects also in the near future that might help with some of that dissemination of information.
Let's move on. Do we have other questions?
Yeah.
I have one more question.
On the back,
Oh,
we've
okay.
got lots of people.
Yeah.
So
I
I
can't see.
some of the design requirements were driven by bridges in the area. Is this dove the same size as the original 1634 dove? And how common was it to cross the ocean in vessels that size?
Repeat the question. Here.
I'll be the.
Want to do the mic runner? I'll be the mic runner.
Do the mic runner. There you go.
So since you mentioned that some of the design requirements were driven by bridges that are currently constructed, how does the size of this representational vessel compare to the original 1634 Dove? And how common was it to cross the ocean in vessels of that size?
We don't know exactly what the original Dove was, but we have a pretty good idea. Because remember, we've got that thumb thing we do, and the squinting thing we do, and we have or that they did back then. And we have a pretty good idea that we're pretty close in size. We don't know, we just don't know exactly. But comparing it with the Ark, and from artwork and other representations, and just in terms of the type that we know about, we have a pretty good idea. And some of it comes from artwork, just scaling from, if we're pretty confident in the artist and in the care that they took in doing the painting, we can do some scale work and we can kind of figure out, okay, well, that back then the average height was about 5'4" or something like that, 5'5", 5'6", and so we can use that as a starting point. All right, well, that's how big the dog was. So, but yeah, they obviously, at least one of them crossed an ocean. We know that. So, oh yeah, and a lot of the ships that crossed oceans back then were not that big. Some were, but a lot weren't.
So I started sailing wooden boats, sailing tall ships. I worked on the Adventurous in Washington State. It's my first schooner. Pride of Baltimore II. We did a Great Lakes tour. I worked in the Netherlands for a little while on a ship called the Nordlies. And then I was either going to sail to Bermuda or do this rigging apprenticeship. And I was really not sold on doing the rigging apprenticeship. A friend actually really convinced me, and it was good because that trip to Bermuda fell through, and I'm here now because I did this rigging apprenticeship in Rhode Island with a master rigger named Jim Barry. We built the standing rigging for the Oliver Hazard Perry, and then I got a job at San Francisco Maritime Museum rigging the Doc Clutha, which is a big full rig ship, and the C.A. Thayer, 3-mast lumber schooner. And then I did go to wooden boat school after that as well at the Arquez School of Wooden Boat Building. And this project, the rig, is interesting. A lot of times we do a rig build, you're just doing the standing and running rigging. Might be a lot of heavy wire work. Maybe you're doing some work on spars, maybe more like design-oriented work. But it's kind of unique to build the spars, build the blocks. It was a really woodworking heavy rigging project. So I definitely used a lot of what I learned with Bob Darr, who is my boat building teacher, as well as one of the other lead shipwrights on the project. Jeff Reed, Bob Darr is his teacher as well. So he's kind of, he's got a legacy here, Bob Darr.
Cool. And we're lucky to have this level of experience. Question in the back.
So I have a question here, going to more practical matters. Looking to the future and hauling the new Dove. Where is it the Chesapeake hauling the Dove at the Chesapeake Maritime Museum, or where on Chesapeake do you have the yards to handle a vessel of this size, as far as the railway, etc.?
You answer that.
Sure. Well, Ivor mentioned that one of our specifications to him was not to exceed 70 long tons. And that's because there are 3 local boat yards within a few miles of us that have 70-ton lifts. And if we had exceeded 70 tons, it would become much more expensive and difficult to maintain the vessel. So in terms of where can you get more than 70 tons, there's a yard in Portsmouth, Virginia, that has a
put up the
large
last
lift.
slide of mine. There you go. You got it.
It's rumored that there's a yard in Cambridge, Maryland, that will be receiving or building a 100-ton lift. although I don't think they're ready yet. I don't think they're there yet. Marine railways tend to have higher capacity. Yeah, join the club, Ira. But marine railways are difficult to maintain and have limitations and are in less and less use. You just did that to make me feel better, right?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And next question.
Oh, there.
Well, there was the question about what a...
Yes, let me have that. Yeah, I'm going to answer a question that was asked about 7 questions ago. 1,879 square feet. Sale area. That was the question, wasn't it? Okay. Yes, sir.
Could you go over the actual sale plan? The actual
Sure.
sales? Yeah.
Sure. I'll start. Let's see. Careful. Thank you. Oh, look what you did. Oh, there we go. All right. We'll start after and go forward. This is the mizzen, and it is in this particular. We found some evidence of this in some of our research. This is a tiller steered boat. It's not a steering wheel. It says a tiller. Well, you'll notice that the tiller is here, and the mizzen is here. And what they did back then in those cases, and what we did, is we have a platform that's sort of suspended between the bulwarks here, and that is where the mizzen mast is stepped on that platform. So it's a little bit like a deck step mast. Then the next sail forward, of course, is the mainsail, and this is the sprit pole that Sam was talking about. That's the spar that we built as a bird's mouth hollow spar. So that's the mainsail. We have the square topsail up here, and we have the what we would call the staysail here, the jib, and then we have what's called the spritsail. It's sometimes affectionately known as the nose bag.
And then is the mizzen lateen rigged?
The mizzen would be lateen rig, yeah. And what you see here, we've done a couple of different things with the sail details. We discovered from the Vasa research that we learned from that how they did the reef points back then. And they did a very neat detail on that. I wish I had that drawing immediately available, but they basically just took the light line that makes the reefing lines, the reef points, and they would twist it to make 3 hockles, sort of extended hockles. And they poke one side of the reef point through the sail and then just sew those hockles to the sail. And there's your reef point. It's a very neat way they did it.
One more sail to mention, Ivor, the main course.
The main course, yes. You'll see the dotted line. See this dotted line here, and here, and here. We do also have a main course, basically another big square sail that hangs below the course yard. In this case, it'll be hoisted from on deck for those times when it'll be used, as opposed to being bent onto the course yard. One other thing we did with interesting, so on this sail we have the reef points, but on this sail, for shortening sail, if you have to shorten sail, we got the reef points here, reef points there. If we want to shorten sail with a mizzen, this portion of the sail is laced on to the foot of the mizzen, and that's called a bonnet. And that gets, so if we want to shorten sail on that sail, we unlace that and remove the bonnet from the sail. So we're showing 2 different ways to reduce sail, both of which were used at the time. Yes, sir.
How would you expect this rig to perform in comparison with the older Dove that we have? This being 4.5 and the other one.
Yeah, well, the idea with this rig, this will go to windward better, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
Now because of stability and requirements, and the fact that this is a fore and aft rig, and and is a Boyer rig. The end result is that this has less sail than the present Dove.
Yeah,
Off the wind.
by about 1,000 square feet.
Yeah, by a fair bit. That is one of the advantages of a square rig, is you can pile on more sail. The downside is you don't go to weather for at all.
And stability becomes a big issue.
And stability becomes an issue. Exactly.
I saw an earlier drawing with a flying jib. Why did you decide to remove that?
Well, that was. I'm sorry you brought that up. Well, we were scratching our heads. Is this something they did back then? Perhaps. Would this come under the heading of experimental archaeology? Perhaps, maybe. And we thought about it, and we went back and forth on it, and finally we just don't see any examples of it anywhere. That's not to say that they didn't. I'm sure somebody back then tried it. Hey, let's see if we can't pile on some more sail here and get this thing going a little faster. But they probably found it was more trouble than it was worth for a variety of reasons. And like I said, we looked for examples and we just didn't see it, so we decided finally, this is just not part of the program. So.
We also had concerns about safety and structure. The modern sailboats with bowsprits have bob stays. For everything, there has to be a counter thing. Okay, if we're going to support a mast from forward, we have to support it from aft as well, with backstays and stays. Well, the bowsprit has only the gimmining lashing keeping it down. So this entire length of bowsprit is cantilevered, to use the engineer's word, and so any upward pull on either of these, either this topmast stay or outer forestay, or jib stay, if you will, that pull is held only by the bending strength of this spar. And when you have a sail drawing, it puts a big sideways pull, and it's like drawing a string on a bow. There's incredible force generated on the ends. And to have that incredible force have one more sail producing incredible force pulling up on the bowsprit is a good way to lose your bowsprit. And while with full knowledge of these concerns, one might be able to carry it carefully in very light airs, sooner or later it's going to get carried in too much wind. And so it just wasn't a good safety decision to include a flying jib. And the Coast Guard probably never would have let us certify it anyway. Any other questions?
Why that rig? Of the range of options, why the Boyer rig versus...
Why the Boyer rig versus other rigs in the range of options?
One other question, what happens in the Richardson Dove now?
Oh, okay. Well, why the Boyer rig is mainly because, as Sam pointed out, there's so many drawings that show that rig, including charts of ships, on the oceans. And so, would 4 out of 6 ocean crossing exploration vessels be Boyers? Maybe. Who knows? We're not claiming that it's a 99% certainty. We're claiming that it's a 25% likelihood. We don't know.
If new research had found someone directly related to the expedition, if you could comment.
Absolutely, yeah. New research could find something cool, yeah. If Ballard or some deep ocean oceanographer comes up with a wreck of the Dove, we're open to. We're not going to say no, that couldn't be. And Barbara.
I just wondered how many people would be serving as crew members, and were there facilities for those crew members? Did they have sleeping areas? Sure. What did they do with their food?
On the original Dove?
Yeah.
All right, so the question is how many people would be serving as crew members and what accommodations and food would they have? Well, that is, happily enough, one of the few things we know a lot about on the original Dove, because the crew went back to England and sued for their wages, and the Admiralty Court has record of not only how many, but their names. So we know there were 7 sailors and an unnamed boy who was an indentured servant. Master Orchard, among other of his own exploits, he bought the indenture of a boy, brought the boy here, sold the indenture for a profit. So 7 men and a boy is exactly how many there were on that vessel, and that factors into why we chose the simple rig, the rig that can be handled with fewer people. And how are they accommodated? That's still open for debate, for research. And it boils down in part to what were the values of the time. Would peasant sailors have been afforded any comforts? Society was much more stratified. The upper and middle class expected some comforts, but it was not necessarily expected that the sailors would be given more than a place to get to shelter from the wind and a coil of rope or an old sail to curl up in. Now, on our vessel, we do represent, we have 4 bunks in the great cabin. The master's cabin has an extra bunk, presumably for a cabin boy. And Ivor's original drawing has 2 bunks in the forecastle, although we turned it into a galley.
Would there have been a captain's cabin?
Well, yes, there is a captain's cabin.
In the original?
Undoubtedly, yes. Because the shipmaster would have been a middle-class merchant who would expect to, and functionally, the master has to be able to defend himself from mutiny. So he has to have a place he can close himself up, and he has to be able to have the guns and the gunpowder under, the weapons under control. So there are various styles and techniques of leadership, but might is good. All right. Any other questions? I think David had a question.
Does the new boat have a cannon on it?
Does the new boat have a cannon on it? All right.
Not yet.
Not yet is the answer. And we have to finesse that a little bit because the Coast Guard has certified a vessel in part on the condition that there are no cannons on board. At least not while passengers are aboard. At least we are not firing any while there are passengers on board. Yeah, people get hinky about gunpowder. Time for 1 or 2 more questions?
One more?
One more? Sir.
What will happen to the old Dove?
All right. Question of the hour. What will happen to the old Dove? You want me to take it?
I mean,
we don't know is the answer. It has not been decided.
There's lots of ideas being bandied about, but our Board of Commissioners has ultimate say, and they have not fully voted on an idea.
Yeah. So that's still a topic of discussion. A hot topic of discussion.
Well,
sir.
You've been talking about the synthetic lines that you're now using, and I noticed today when we walked they were. Have they been tested using the wood you're using? Because many of your sailors may not know what they have to change in terms of judgment for keeping from fouling lines and breaking spars and so on.
So do I understand you're asking, with the modern synthetic ropes,
yes,
what issues do we have to watch out for? What's different?
Just for in your handling of the rig.
Versus if these were all hemp or natural fiber ropes. Sam, you want to address that?
Yeah. So there are very few people alive today that have experience sailing vessels with hemp or manila rigging. The reason why is because we don't grow hemp for the production of rope anymore. In the 17th century, all over Europe, and especially in southern Europe and in the colonies, they grew a lot of different types of hemp. And the hemp had there were different cultivars, and they were grown to have longer or shorter fibers that were softer or harder. And you would use a shorter and softer hemp plant, a different cultivar for clothing, and for rigging you might have a longer fiber. Today we're starting to grow hemp again for clothing, but not for ropes. So it's virtually impossible to get hemp fiber that's suitable for ropes. So it's not that we don't have hemp or anything like that. It's just that we don't have the ropes. So when they did sail with hemp, it was really challenging because every time it rains, it shrinks. So when it rains or before it rains, you anticipate it, so you add a little bit of slack into every line on the vessel. And then it slackens after it dries, and then you have to take up on every line on the vessel, which they called freshening the nip. There's a lot of work. A sailor would have to go around constantly adjusting lines, and not to hoist sails or anything like that, just making small adjustments. Every single buntline, which holds all the sails up, all these lines you can see going across the sails are brails, clewlines, buntlines, and it was a chore. Today we don't have to worry about that. What we do have to worry about is something fouling and a sailor maybe not paying attention to it, and then maybe, this would be very foolish, but thinking, oh, I got to take this to the windlass, and we have a small windlass and a big windlass. And if they did that with that amount of mechanical advantage, you could break a spar. In some cases, there are, in actually a number of cases, there are ropes on the vessel that are stronger than some of the pieces of wood, certainly stronger than some of the blocks and some of the spars. But it would be very unlikely on this vessel that you could do damage by over tightening any of the running or standing rigging. We don't have that amount of mechanical advantage built into the running rigging, and we just don't have those kinds of forces on this vessel. So I think that the sailors on the previous Dove, they're already used to similar ropes. Any sailor that's worked on any other tall ship, they've used probably even the same brand, some of these same ropes. So I don't think that you would anticipate any big surprises. I would actually say that if we had hemp or manila, a sailor would take quite a lot of training. And you can break. I actually did sail on a vessel that had manila, and it breaks all the time. It rots.
What is the synthetic fiber that you're using?
So mostly polyester. A lot of the rope is it's a low stretch spun polyester. It's UV resistant, soft in hand, abrasion resistant. Some of the lower load lines on the vessel that also are highly susceptible to chafe, like brails. There's nothing you can do about brails getting chafed. Those lines are UV treated polypropylene called Polytex, which is like Roblon, which the current vessel uses. And it's pretty good rope. We have some higher quality rope, but it's going to last a long time, but it's also easy to replace, not a big deal to replace. And then we have actually one of the higher tech materials the shrouds are made of. It's kind of, I wouldn't call it a test product, but it's not on the market. It's called Mystic 3-Strand, produced by New England Ropes. And it's a 3-strand rope, and each strand has a core of Dyneema. And Dyneema, if anyone is familiar with modern yachting at all, Dyneema it's stronger than steel per diameter. So a quarter-inch steel cable versus a quarter-inch Dyneema, which is super soft fiber. It's about 5 times stronger. You can lift up a school bus with a quarter-inch piece of Dyneema. And it's the kind of thing where if theoretically you took the boat and you stretched the rigging out, you would probably cause a compression break in the mainmast, or you could cause a mast step failure, or you call the bronze to break off the chain plates. But those shrouds are they're crazy strong. The whole boat could sail with just one of those shrouds for the transverse rigging. Probably even of a smaller diameter. But